Madam Vice President, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Roch Marc Christian Kabore, President of Burkina Faso, on this, the 75th anniversary of 75th session rather of the General Assembly. Thank you. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, heads of delegation, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, my delegation and I are glad of this opportunity to warmly congratulate you on your brilliant election as President of the 75th session of the General Assembly. Mr. Outgoing President, dear Professor Tijani Mohamed Bande, when you assumed the office of President of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of Africa, never would we have imagined that our organization, and in fact the entire world, would be experiencing a health crisis as severe as COVID-19. And faced with this unpredictable situation, you, along with your team, were able to adapt to the new exigencies and to take up the challenges before you to ensure business continuity and continued operations of the General Assembly. Mr. Secretary General, on the 22nd of January, you presented to the General Assembly your 2020 priorities and identified what you refer to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse, namely global geostrategic tensions, the existential climate crisis, and the growing distrust of peoples across the world and the dark side of the digital world. Unfortunately, less than 2 months afterwards, a fifth very destructive horseman of the apocalypse burst onto the scene, the coronavirus, and joined the four horsemen you identified. And since then, you did your utmost to ensure that the United Nations could tackle this pandemic and its multidimensional consequences. Mr. President, heads of delegation, on the 14th of June 2019, the United Nations General Assembly, through Resolution 73/299, decided to celebrate the 75th anniversary of our common organization under the theme, "The Future We Want, the UN We Need," reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism. However, with the global crisis unleashed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the President of the General Assembly completed the general theme of this celebration with the mention, "Confronting Coronavirus Through Effective Multilateral Action." This theme, which underpins all the activities, meetings, and conferences organized by the United Nations in 2020, comes as a reminder of the fundamental reasons for the creation of our organization. And for the commemoration of this anniversary, we would have liked all of us to be present physically here in New York at headquarters to together celebrate the values advocated and defended by the United Nations since its creation in 1945. Unfortunately, the pandemic dictated otherwise, reminding us of the fragility of our world and our interdependence. By the 9th of March 2020, Burkina Faso was recording its first cases of COVID-19, and the government had to adapt its actions to the realities of the moment by applying quarantine and lockdown measures for cities and other restrictions. The COVID-19 pandemic is a multidimensional crisis, and it may well bring to naught all efforts towards development in many countries, especially those affected by conflict. And it's for this reason that Burkina Faso thanks the UN Secretary General for his global call for solidarity made on the 31st of March 2020. This helped establish a global framework geared towards an integrated and flexible response to take full advantage of the UN system's global footprint. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the debt alleviation measures taken in favor of developing countries. But more importantly, I would like to call for cancellation of our debt, pure and simple. Mr. President, heads of delegation, a few months ago, the issue of organized crime was looked at essentially through the lens of counterterrorism. And today, with the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic, going forward, we must take into account the trifecta of organized crime, terrorism, and COVID-19. In the war against terrorism in the Sahel region, I wish to express my appreciation to the international community for its support and for accompanying us. Proof positive, if ever there were need for proof, that counterterrorism is a question of international security. From a purely military standpoint, we would like to highlight some significant strides made by the G5 Sahel Joint Force and friendly troops. We cannot fail to mention either the highly appreciated involvement of the Secretary General, the Security Council, and the European Union in the review in February 2020 of the technical agreement between the European Union, the United Nations, and the G5 Sahel, which now makes it possible to extend MINUSMA's support to the G5 Sahel Joint Force beyond the borders of Mali. Nevertheless, it is regrettable that the force did not reach the level envisaged. I would therefore like to call on the Security Council to ensure that this force is placed under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter to benefit from sustainable financing. I would also like to make a strong plea to all partners to actively support the International Coalition for the Sahel, which was established in January 2020 in Pau in France. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, in our fight against terrorism, organizations have accused our defense and security forces of abuses and human rights violations. And here, I wish to reaffirm that our defense and security forces carry out their missions with respect for human rights, notably the right to life and the right to physical integrity of persons as enshrined in the legal instruments to which Burkina Faso is party. On all occasions when defense and security forces were named in accusations, we opened inquiries to ascertain those responsible and to punish the perpetrators. I'm keen to reassure Burkina Faso's partners and the international community that despite our modest means, our defense and security forces have been fighting terrorism with professionalism and while strictly adhering to the rules of engagement governing their actions. At all events, Burkina Faso will spare no effort to take up the challenges of tackling terrorism to guarantee protection for our populations and our people and refugees, and we will continue to work to restore peace and security across our entire country while respecting the rules of international law. In this connection, on the 1st of July, my government notified its agreement to open an office of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Mr. President, heads of delegation, in Burkina Faso, voters will go to the polls on the 22nd of November 2020 for presidential and legislative elections. The entire political class of the country, majority and opposition alike, decided based on consensus to proceed with elections despite the insecurity prevailing in certain regions of the country. I reaffirm the commitment of my government to organize transparent, inclusive, and peaceful elections. And to this end, since July 2019, I set up a framework for political dialogue on a permanent basis with all components of the Burkina Faso political class to remove any obstacles that could arise throughout the process. In Burkina Faso, we became very aware very early of the need to preserve the environment. All our policies contained provisions to reverse the trend of environmental degradation and to ensure sustainable management of our natural resources. The tragic floods experienced in the past few weeks in our country and in several other African countries come as a reminder of the need for a stronger commitment to a multilateral approach as embodied in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mr. President, heads of delegation, as a troop contributing country accompanying the United Nations in its search for peace, Burkina Faso deploys 1,130 men, including 1 battalion and 2 formed police units and 69 troops. And I'd like to take this opportunity to reaffirm our readiness to always engage alongside the United Nations in the quest for peace across the world by deploying our uniformed personnel and our legal experts. Mr. President, heads of delegations, the world we live in is frightening because international peace and security are threatened by global geostrategic tensions. Still today, African questions are highest in number on the Security Council's agenda. The lingering security crisis in the Sahel region and the Lake Chad Basin is a real concern to which responses must be found, keeping in mind that the situation created in Libya is one of the causes. This means, therefore, that settling the political crisis in Libya is one of the prerequisites for restoring peace in these regions. We therefore call on the Security Council to appoint the new special joint UN-African Union envoy to lead these negotiations. In Mali, we call for a settlement of the political crisis and a rapid return to constitutional order, and we support the ECOWAS decisions for a civilian transition. On the Western Sahara dossier, the notable gains made following the roundtables in Geneva between Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, and the Polisario should be secured. And Burkina Faso, in this regard, wishes to see the new special envoy pursue what his predecessor had achieved. In the Middle East, and specifically in the Israelo-Palestinian conflict, there is a strong case to be made for renewed diplomatic efforts to put an end to this conflict. And with respect to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba since 1962, we reiterate our call for it to be lifted. We congratulate Cuba on curbing the pandemic and its international solidarity in sending hundreds of doctors and medical personnel to 35 countries across the world in response to requests for immediate assistance. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, 75 years after its creation and after more than 20 years of intergovernmental negotiations, United Nations reform is still underway, but still behind. And yet, everyone agrees that any reform should redress the injustice done to Africa and that the African claim is a legitimate aspiration. I reiterate my country's support for the common African position as reflected in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, under which Africa should be fully represented in all decision-making bodies of the United Nations, and in particular in the Security Council. Mr. President, heads of delegation, ladies and gentlemen, by adopting on the 21st of September the final declaration on commemorating the 75th anniversary of our organization, we thus recognize that our organization has not attained the mark that its founding fathers had envisaged, because poverty, hunger, terrorism, extremism, and even insecurity, to name a few, are still issues we are grappling with. Faced with this fact, we made a historic decision to leave no one behind, to promote peace and digital cooperation, and to take young people, women, and girl children into account in all our development policies. We recognize the interdependence of the various challenges facing the United Nations, which can be resolved only through strengthened multilateralism. For this reason, it is my hope that the report of the Secretary General, which will be proposed before the closure of the 75th session, will enable us to look to the future with more optimism. Once again, we reaffirm our collective commitment to multilateralism. The United Nations must remain our common compass. Long live the United Nations. Long live international cooperation.